All right. Again, thanks for joining me. I'm John Kane. This is Resistance Radio, and we are going to be talking about resistance. For those who get a chance to see the video, I am wearing my Merciless Indian Savages T-shirt because when you look at when you read the text of the Declaration of Independence, I think it's important that people realize that we are the only ones mentioned, other than the King of England, other than filing the complaint against Great Britain in the first place. We are the only ones that are singled out. And we are singled out and referred to as merciless Indian savages because the claim that Jefferson was making in his declaration that was signed by so many of these American patriots was that the Great Britain was soliciting our help, Native people's help, in quelling the resistance. And frankly, there was probably just cause for quelling the resistance because one of the things that I think when people study the Declaration of Independence, I think it's worth noting that everything that Jefferson and those who signed that document were complaining about regarding Great Britain is what the United States has done. And they've done it consistently, and they've done it for, going on 250 years. So I think it's important that people realize, and they should read it. I mean, you should read what the complaints are. I mean, when you read all of the complaints that are made because they say, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. That's what they say. But then when you realize everything that they've complained about, I mean, they even complained about Great Britain limiting immigration, which is what this country is doing now. I mean, the very things that Trump is, waging this war against immigration is the antithesis of what of what the colonists were trying to do in pushing back against Great Britain, trying to limit the population flow. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, it is so consistent. It's so consistently inconsistent. Everything that the United States represents today, all of the things that they've complained about other nations, the United States and their presence throughout the world, military presence, which is exactly one of the things that they were complaining about in the Declaration of Independence. Many of the things almost everything that they complained that Great Britain was doing to the colonists, the United States is doing everywhere else on the globe. I mean, and we're not just talking about doing things politically. We're talking about military. We're talking about killing people. Okay, let's just cut to the chase here. And that's what's happening consistently. And for all of the language in the U.S. Constitution about almost the separation of church and state and that kind of stuff, I mean, it's anything but at this point. So I think it's important that people realize by reading it, you should read the Declaration of Independence first off. I mean, because most of you haven't. And most of you don't know that Native people are singled out. They're referred to us as merciless Indian savages. And they condemn our means of defending our lands and that kind of stuff. They do all of that stuff. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. It's pretty remarkable when you consider what the allegations are, what the charges are in the Declaration of Independence, and then you look at what the United States is doing on a daily basis throughout the planet. And of course, doing it with such arrogance. And look, it's easy to single out Donald Trump because he is among the worst, and certainly the worst modern day president of the United States. But he's not alone. Some of the things Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, look, they insult Native people by carving his face among others on the in Lakota territory on Mount Rushmore. But this is a guy who basically said that we were that we were better off dead. I mean, he suggests that if you look too closely, 9 out of 10 of us are just savages, and you wouldn't want to look too closely at the 10th. I mean, it's incredible some of the things that have been said throughout the U.S. history, and even more contemporaneously. I mean, some of the things that get said not only by Donald Trump throughout his illustrious business career, but even some of the things that he says now as in his second term as the president. But look, I've been working on a bit of a manuscript that I was going to entitled in some form or fashion called Rana de Gaius, which is the name that we had given the first president of the United States, and it translates to town destroyer. And what we've done is we've used that word now as our word for the president of the United States, because every one of them has done this. Every one of them has, in some form or fashion, sought to destroy us, sought to destroy who we are as a people, eliminate us in ways that it's. I mean, there was a series of policies that Native people experienced, and they begin with things like murder, extermination, even the intentional spread of disease. Yeah, I mean, Lord Jeffrey Amherst knew that they had blankets that were infected, and if they distributed them and made it look like they were doing some great service to Native people, if they distributed it to Native people, they could kill us. They could be among the first to really utilize germ warfare against the people who they hadn't even really declared as an enemy. I mean, and that's the remarkable stuff here. Much of what the United States has done throughout the 250 years of its existence has cast us as an enemy without ever declaring us directly, without telling us that they were regarding us as their enemy. And of course, the thing that I think is worth noting is when you read not just the Declaration of Independence, but the U.S. Constitution, we're not included. We're mentioned. I mean, again, we are specifically mentioned, and we're called Merciless Indian Savages in their Declaration of Independence. In the U.S. Constitution, we are referred to as Indians not taxed, which is a way to distinguish us from some Native people who were participating in their commerce stream more directly. So this is, I mean, that's the way we're referred to in the U.S. Constitution, and it basically says that we are not counted, that we are not among the counted population. I mean, they talk about representation by Congress, and they said excluding Indians not taxed. In other words, we're not involved. And the only other place we're mentioned is in basically the Commerce Clause, where they put us right on par with foreign nations, and so I mean you can't distinguish a people as clearly as the United States has done from their Declaration of Independence to their Constitution to their amending of Constitution. Look, even the 14th Amendment, when they were finally addressing the inequity involved in citizenship for the formerly enslaved, for black people in general, and they basically declare that all those born in the United States and subject to U.S. jurisdiction are U.S. citizens. Now, they didn't include us in that. In fact, the second part of that 14th Amendment makes it real clear that they're excluding Indians not taxed, and that's the way that they were referring to us, right? So we are consistently not included. And then but in spite of that, I mean, they began to regard us as if we were somehow wards of the federal government. I mean, we're not citizens. We're not a part. We're not including the population. None of that stuff. But they're still designating themselves without any kind of legal framework the trustees of Native people. Now, we're not U.S. citizens when they do this. I mean, they've been doing this since the early 1800s. They were making up, fabricating this logic. Chief Justice John Marshall is the one who said it's kind of like a ward to the government. That's the way he referred to us. And then they codify that more by the time they get into the later 1800s. But we're still not U.S. citizens. We're still not included in part of their population, but we're being counted as being subject to their authority without any legal basis for it. But in 1924, they declare that we are U.S. citizens. They don't offer U.S. citizenship. They don't provide a pathway. They don't, give an application. They just declare it. I mean, in what world can you actually do that to people? Well, look, they essentially did it to the formerly enslaved, but the formerly enslaved, for them, going from being in bondage to white folks to being elevated to the limitations that involve citizenship, U.S. citizenship, but they had no ability to claim any other nationality. But Native people, we were always consistently being regarded as a distinct people, always distinct people. In fact, distinct peoples. Let's be clear here. I mean, 700 to 1,000 distinct nations that the United States just kind of lumped us all together in, and makes these claims like that we are like wards of the federal government. I mean, they just say that. There's no proof to it. And then when they declare as U.S. citizens, it wasn't an offer. It wasn't like, well, let's, we're going to streamline. We're going to build a streamlined process that allows you the full faith and credit that goes along with being a U.S. citizen. No, that's not what they did. They just declared it unilaterally. And the crazy part is, if you're not a U.S. citizen, if you come to this country from another country, you have to make like a pledge. I mean, you have to, they test you, and then you swear an oath to you swear allegiance to the United States. We didn't do that. There was never an allegiance test. There was never an oath that we had to make. So there was never anything on our side. In fact, many Native people didn't even know that they were being declared U.S. citizens by the United States. I mean, it really wouldn't be until, for many people, and I'm Gunyagahaga, Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, it wasn't until draft registration or draft notices started showing up in some of our territories for World War II that people said, wait, you can't draft us. They said, oh yeah, we made you citizens a couple of decades ago. What do you mean you made us citizens? I mean, most of our people weren't even aware, because it's not like we had a direct line of communication here. So they declare that we're U.S. citizens, and and we're not even involved in the process. And then we start getting draft notices heading into World War II. And it's not like our people didn't enlist in the military at alarmingly high rates, which is a whole nother issue. And that has a lot to do with subjugation and, prejudice and that kind of stuff. But so we raised the issue that you can't just, draft us into your military. And the solution ended up being, crazy as it is that the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, they joined the United States in declaring war against the Axis powers. I mean, there's no real justification for it other than the United States and obviously the allied nations had already done so. But this was a way to smooth over the fact that they were forcing us into their military. But I mean, the crazy part is, for everything that they've done, they've always known that it wasn't 100%. And here's what I mean by that. So they declare that we're U.S. citizens in 1924, which is illegal as hell at the international level, by the way. It's illegal as hell. I mean, this is essentially characterized, it was already being characterized in, I think like 1914 or something like that, as denationalization. That's what they called it. But to strip away somebody's national character and impose another nation's character upon them is a war crime. That's what the international community was already saying a decade before the United States goes and does it to us. And nobody said a word. Of course, this was all being done because of World War I, right? This is all being done because of some of the atrocities that are taking place in Europe. I mean, this idea of calling this denationalization a war crime wasn't because of what they were doing to us. Nobody cared. I mean, the rest of the world didn't care, honestly. I mean, and here's the crazy part. Let me go here. Hawaii, which was a distinct nation with consulates and embassies throughout the world, recognized throughout the world as an independent sovereign nation. All of the rest of the world remained silent when the United States literally just took them over and didn't even do it through any kind of legitimate process. I mean, there wasn't like a treaty of concession. They called it an annexation treaty, but it was amongst a bunch of white people in Hawaii who said, "Oh, we want to be part of the United States." And the only reason they wanted to be part of the United States was to avoid some of the sugar tariffs that was being imposed upon them because they had already taken over much of the agriculture of the Hawaiian Islands. I mean, guys like Dole, Francis Dole, like Dole pineapple, that guy, yeah. These are the folks who were essentially committing a coup against the Hawaiian kingdom, then called themselves a republic, and then sought to be taken over by the United States. And they didn't even do it through what would be a consistent legal process. The United States didn't. It's not like they entered into a treaty that with the consent of 2/3 of the Senate. No, they did it through a joint resolution of Congress. You know what joint resolutions of Congress are for? Holidays, for national parks, for doing these rudimentary, domestic policy things. It's not the same thing as passing a law or a constitutional amendment. One that would be required to introduce a whole nother territory as another state or as a territory of the United States. No, they didn't do that. They did it through a simple majority through a joint resolution of Congress. Nothing even legal. It's not even legal. I mean, and this is the part that's crazy and inconsistent about what the United States does. I mean, so I've talked about this on a previous show, but so essentially all people of African descent were made designated U.S. citizens by the 14th Amendment. They amended the Constitution of the United States to basically say anybody born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction, which meant they were excluding Native people, are hereby U.S. citizens. They didn't say they qualify. They didn't say you can be, or here's the process, we're going to streamline. No, they just declared it. So many people, and many among who were the formerly enslaved, if they weren't living in what was considered a free state, but black people weren't U.S. citizens before this. And then they became that with or without their own permission. So now we look at Hawaii. In Hawaii, they do a joint resolution of Congress, which is not the same thing as passing a law, where they basically just annex the Kingdom of Hawaii, the territories of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and then they declare all those Hawaiian people their citizens. They didn't offer citizenship. They didn't do anything that would invite them or give them an option. I mean, it's not like the Hawaiian people said, well, "No, we'll pass. We're good. We're going to stay who we are." No, that wasn't even given a choice. And consistent with what Native people were experiencing around on the continent, you got to believe that many of the Hawaiian people didn't even know. But you know what they did? They started their own petition. They did this thing called the Kue petition. And they had tens of thousands of Hawaiians. And the population had somewhat diminished, but they had tens of thousands. The vast majority of Hawaiian people rejected the takeover of their Hawaiian kingdom and the forcing of U.S. citizenship. Those are called the Kue petitions. But the United States just ignored it. And they just keep going as if none of this stuff ever was problematic. So then in 1924, they declare that Native people are all U.S. citizens. They just declare it. I mean, it's not like there was an offer. It wasn't like there was a naturalization process. And look, and I get it. Some Native people were vying, were hoping to be U.S. citizens. And some we're functioning essentially within the U.S. system. So, I mean, the reason that expression "Indians not taxed" is mentioned not only in the U.S. Constitution originally, but even mentioned in the 14th Amendment. The reason it's mentioned is because there were some Native people who were no longer living amongst Native populations that were working within the commerce stream and were doing a whole host of things that were somewhat consistent with with what with U.S. citizenship. So I mean, that's what was happening. But the vast majority of Native people, even though the hardships that would befall Native people who were living in Native communities, the vast majority of us, we weren't a part of it, and we were out of communication. So when things were happening in Washington or in state capitals, we weren't even aware of it. It's not like it's not like you pick up the phone and somebody would call us, hey, we just passed a law about you. And that's what they would do. They would invariably affect state and national policies about Native people, and we would be totally unaware of it. And then these things would exist sometimes for decades. Like I said, the fact that they would pass the Indian Citizenship Act, and the vast majority of Native people wouldn't even be aware of it. We weren't really aware of it until draft notices started showing up for World War II. I mean, that's the lack of consistency that was happening, the continuity that existed in the United States. So let me talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, because I think it's worth noting that almost everything written in that declaration that is served up as a complaint against the King of England, the United States has done every bit the same thing and worse. I mean, they've literally quartered their soldiers within our territories, if not directly in our homes. I mean, all of the most egregious things that are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson drafted and so many of these American patriots signed on to, almost everything that they complained that Great Britain was doing, the United States did the same and would do so for 250 years and still do them. I mean, let's be honest. The vast majority of military bases are not in the United States. They're scattered throughout the world. They've imposed their military might throughout the world. And they have wreaked havoc on many Native peoples, or many nations, I should say. And see, this isn't consistent. This isn't what they teach you in history class. This isn't what they teach you in civics, in American civics classes. No, they don't teach any of this stuff. But as a Native person, I know what our experience has been. But then when I look around the world and I realize just what they've done to others, and I'm not just talking about North America and South America or Central America. I'm talking about every place. Even the role the United States played in the colonization of Africa. I mean, they were giving advice. The formation of the state of Israel, the role that the United States played there. And I'm sorry, look, I just got to mention this. For those who consistently feel like they've got to post some comment about code talkers and the role that Native people played in World War II, mostly in on the Japanese front, but throughout the military engagement. Let's be clear: our people were forced into those positions. We didn't sign up to offer our language as a means to beat the Japanese code breakers or the German code breakers. No. Somebody came up with the idea that the very language that the United States was trying to kill and would continue to try to kill, the native languages, the indigenous languages throughout North America. And it wasn't just Navajo code talkers. There were essentially code talkers from every nation where they had conscripted an individual that had some of their native language intact. And of course, we weren't just speaking our language on the radios. It wasn't even that. They would use our words as a code. So our people still had to be trained how to use our language to offer misdirection to the Japanese and the Germans. But what people don't realize is the code became so important that for every code talker who was on the field, in the field, they would have a minder. They would have somebody whose job was to make sure that person, that native person who was speaking their language as a part of the code to communicate military strategies and directives and orders, that if that person were to be captured, they would have a fellow enlisted man kill them rather than let them be captive. Because our people were so insignificant in terms of importance compared to what they were using our language for. So code talkers wasn't the hero for the United States. The codes were. And if rather than allowing any native person who was involved in any of this code talking program to be captured, they would have a person designated from the United States side, a fellow enlisted man whose job it was to kill them. Because protecting the code was more important than protecting the code talker. And they didn't want the code broken. So when I see posts, and I've been seeing them for years because, little by little, these code talkers from World War II, have succumbed to age. I mean, I don't know if there's any of them that are still alive anymore. But the owner of the Washington football team was parading a bunch of Navajo code talkers up, putting the Redskins jackets on, parading them across at their field. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, folks. And again, if you're going to post some memorial for an individual who served as a code talker, and that's the only thing in their life that you're going to talk about. Look, there was a guy who was a code talker who served in leadership for the Navajo. Peter McDonald, I think his name was. And he was a scumbag. I mean, this is a guy who ripped off his own people. So for all the heroizing that went on for these code talkers, if you never said, well, what else did they do in their life? I mean, did they have any other positive attributes that could be in their lives? And I'm not saying they didn't, but if the only thing that they were ever being acknowledged for was for allowing their language to be used in a war that was not ours, it wasn't ours. Our lands weren't attacked. And the fact that Pearl Harbor was bombed for one reason only, because of the U.S. military buildup to threaten Japan in the first place. They didn't bomb the rest of Hawaii. They bombed the naval yard only. So I think it's important that people realize when people talk about, well, you have to understand World War II is the first time that the United States was ever had U.S. soil bombed or engaged in battle, since Great Britain, obviously. But you had an illegal occupation of the Hawaiian Islands at the time. You had illegally taken over a sovereign nation. So, and in fact, the Kingdom of Hawaii had relationships with Japan. I mean, and good relationships with Japan. There was even the possibility, and this isn't widely talked about, that there was some royals from Japanese royalty and Hawaiian royalty that were going to be wedded, and I don't know what that was going to mean. Look, I'm not crazy about Hawaii being taken over by Japan either, but you have to understand the role that the United States has played throughout the globe, but certainly from a native standpoint, and I'm including Native Hawaiians in this mix. Because what Native Hawaiians have endured has been, it was consistent with what the United States was doing to Native people on the continent. And in fact, look, the U.S. media was constantly referring to Hawaiians as monkeys. Their cartoons, political cartoons, whether they were talking about Queen Liliuokalani or any of the the notables in Hawaii. It was consistently trying to make our people, or in this case, Hawaiian people, look like animals or like monkeys. I mean, this is the overt racism that existed. And look, I know that Native people enlisted in the U.S. military and continue to enlist in the U.S. military at alarmingly high rates. But let's be clear why. Because the reason is pretty clear. You've created a situation where life is almost untenable for Native people on Native lands. The abject poverty that has been created on Native territories and has only been stemmed through the exploitation of our lands, through mining, through through the stripping of natural resources, including water, and then to the extent that any territories have gotten involved in gaming, your abuse of tax systems that have no place on our territories in the first place have put us in a situation where even when we did something like gaming, you've managed to wrestle control. And you do so because in order for us to do something like gaming, we rely on non-native patrons. And we also rely on non-native vendors. And when you threaten the patrons and you threaten the vendors, it makes it more and more difficult. So yeah, when they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, the first thing they did was force us to do something that we were vehemently opposed to, which was to forge gaming compacts with the states. We were always at odds with the states. We had somewhat of a different relationship with the United States, with the federal government, but even that was very oppressive. Time and time again, the federal government would oftentimes empower the states over our territories, and everything from civil and criminal jurisdictions to to the stripping of lands, to the stripping of status. So I mean, look, our relationship with the United States and the individual states has never been one of equity. Has never been that. But regardless of that, by the time you pass the Indian Citizenship Act and declare that we are U.S. citizens, that's not a step up for us. Even if it did stem some of the more racist and violent attacks that our Native people were experiencing, most of that ended in the previous century. 1890 was the last violence, really overtly violent confrontation between Native peoples and the United States. I'm not saying there hasn't been plenty of violence since then. We're seeing it all the time. We're seeing it with ICE agents. We've seen it with the FBI. Wounded Knee. I mean, Wounded Knee has this history of both the attacks from the military and then the attacks by the FBI and the goon squad of the guardians of the Oglala Nation, which were puppets of the United States. I mean, when Native people continue to be faced with the United States is a constant barrage of exploitation. And I mean, even this immigration policy that the United States has with their ICE agents out there, Native people are being rounded up as if we were illegal aliens. And here's the crazy part: the way they characterize the U.S. population, you are either a U.S. citizen or some sort of national. And I live on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. This land is not part of the United States. I am not a lawful permanent resident of the United States. I live on the territories of the Seneca Nation. Now, I've never surrendered my right to travel through my ancestral homelands, but to suggest the moment I step off of the territory of the Cattaraugus Seneca territory that I'm automatically subject to U.S. jurisdiction and that any of my native identity is like gone in the wind, that's absurd. It's unlawful. And yet most people won't challenge it. Even as we've seen these ICE agents picking up Native peoples, we're not ever being directed to stand by on our own citizenship. We're being forced to claim U.S. citizenship and then membership, like we are enrolled members of a native territory, a native nation. Well, nations don't have membership, they have citizenship. And I'm not even crazy about that language, frankly, because I don't consider myself a citizen of the Mohawk Nation or a permanent resident of the Seneca Nation. I am a native person. My identity predates the United States, predates any British colonies. It predates Columbus. It predates all that stuff. That's who I am. And I have a right to claim that. And nobody has the right to strip that away. And the fact that many nations around the world will support this abuse that the United States continues to look. Only 4 nations in the world, as far as the sovereign states defined under the UN Charter, only 4 nations voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples: the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. 4 nations. Now, a few others didn't vote, but the vast and overwhelming majority voted to approve the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's not even inconsistent with the UN Declaration on human rights. It just made sure that we're being considered as human beings, essentially. And the one theme that is consistent throughout the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is free, prior, and informed consent. Not consultation, not getting a letter in the mail telling us that the United States is doing something. No, free, prior, and informed consent. What that essentially means is if the United States is adopting a policy, or any nation that has indigenous peoples, because this is a global declaration, if any nation is establishing a policy that has an adverse effect on native peoples, on indigenous peoples throughout the globe, that we have veto power. We have free, prior, we have the right to express free, prior, and informed consent, or free, prior, and informed rejection. Now, the United States says, well, our only obligation is to provide consultation, not to solicit consent. And that's still the consistent policy. The United States rejected. They didn't just vote against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They have rejected it out of hand consistently, and they still reject it. They say, oh, we admire and we support the aspirations of the agreement. Barack Obama, the black president, Barack Obama, he said, we support the aspirations of the agreement, provided it doesn't conflict with U.S. law. Well, what the hell do you think they passed it for? They passed it because countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, you are violating the rights of native peoples, indigenous peoples. So yeah, the problem is your laws and what your laws have allowed and continue to allow. Part of the thing that the United States, the reason they opposed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was they had a real problem with language that would somehow grant or acknowledge that we had any rights whatsoever. I mean, so this notion that we would possess some levels of inherent sovereignty, that was problematic for the United States. They said, no, we only we allow a certain level of tribal sovereignty. We put the word tribal in front of it, which essentially means not sovereignty. And that's what the United States has consistently tried to do. They insist that we are theirs. And even in 1924, when they passed their Indian Citizenship Act, there's no process in there that allowed us to challenge it. So they treat us as if we had no say in the matter, which is completely inconsistent with what the world had already been saying for a decade. In fact, they called denationalization a crime, a punishable crime. And then what they defined as denationalization was the stripping away of an individual's national character. which is exactly what the United States did a decade after this war crime was being asserted and established by the international community. Now, they didn't do it for us. Let's be clear. They didn't pass this, this notion that denationalization was a war crime because of what they were doing to us. No, this was a European thing. But the fact that the United States is still doing it and still has no ability to really acknowledge our distinction. So even when they have this so-called federal recognition process, here's a question that I have, and I bring it up fairly consistently. If we are genuinely all U.S. citizens at this point, which I reject, if we are U.S. citizens, do any native treaties still remain? Do they exist? Because this is the part that's crazy. Because the United States, I mean, look, we had a case, fairly recently out in Washington State, where they were, trying to charge somebody for selling fuel, traveling with fuel across territory lines because they were selling tax-free fuel to other native territories, and the Yakima, argued, and they argued, treaties, and the United States ruled in favor of the Yakima, of the individual proprietor who was being sued in the court. And the Yakima Nation, they submitted briefs as an amicus brief, as a concerned party, not as a defendant or neither plaintiff or defendant, and they raised issues about, again, the doctrine of Christian discovery, all of these legal doctrines, but they also, raised some of their treaty arguments, and the court ruled in favor of the defendant. But my question is, how can you even suggest you still honor so-called treaties if you somehow can't recognize that we are a distinct people anymore? If you've forced your citizenship upon us in 1924, if you've imposed your citizenship upon us, where does that leave the binding agreements that you entered into nation to nation with us? Now, granted, in the late 1800s, you were already saying that we were no longer sovereign nations and you were no longer going to recognize us as such. But that's just because you said it didn't mean it's not true. But then 50 years later, when you declare that we are hereby U.S. citizens, whether we want to be or not, and that you can impose and of course you did this in 1924, knowing that it didn't really hold up. Because a decade later, you tried to do another law where you tried to determine what was recognizable as a native people anymore. So, I mean, and to this day, when we look at like lands, you still cite your laws from the 1930s on whether we were under your jurisdiction or not, which means that your blanket policies, citizenship, and all of these other laws that you've passed, that there's holes in them. And of course there's holes in them, because how can you impose, how can you eradicate and eliminate? And I don't care how many native peoples go along with this stuff, and far too many do. And I got to tell you, I won't vote in an election. I will not claim U.S. citizenship. I will not claim New York citizenship. I am Mohawk. I'm Gunjagahaga, and I live on the territory of the Onondaga, the Seneca Nation. That's who I am, and that's where I am. That's where I'm doing the show from right now. Those merciless Indian savages that you talked about in your Declaration of Independence, you were talking about us. How do I know? Because Great Britain was trying to solicit our support in their war against the colonists, and some of us participated. Not all, but some did. And in fact, the Oneidas and the Cayugas, arguably more aligned with the colonists, were the Mohawks and the Senecas, pretty much, and Onondagas, I guess, more aligned with the, with their previous relationship with Great Britain. Now, it doesn't mean that we all fought on one side or the other, but we became victims of their war. And when I say victims, I mean victims. I mean, George Washington, in his Sullivan campaign, basically codified terrorism. He said, let them know the terror of their chastisement. And don't accept any pleas for peace. Don't accept surrender. That's what George Washington told his generals, Sullivan and Clinton and those guys. Accept no pleas for peace. We need to impose intergenerational trauma so that these Native people will never rise up again. They will never dare challenge. And that's George Washington. We've got Thomas Jefferson saying similar things. He was saying similar things, that we only need to crush them if they ever were to oppose us again. So I mean, this is these faces are carved on the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore. You've got Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson carved into those walls, and every one of them were overt racists against Native peoples and others, but certainly Native peoples. I mean, the only logical thing to do throughout Mount Rushmore is to let those faces be struck from those. Well, let the natural process play out. And let those mountains return. Yeah, the crazy part is the Lakota referred to that mountain, that rock formation, as the grandfathers, because they could see faces in those hills. So what did white folks do? They carved white faces onto those hills, and it stands as a desecration of Lakota territory. So we're a couple of weeks away, 3 weeks away, I guess, 3 weeks out from the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But I'll tell you, I hope somebody would read it. I invite any of you to read the facts submitted to the candid world, as Jefferson wrote it, and realize that everything Jefferson accused Great Britain of doing, the United States is doing themselves. And the crazy part is, they complained about Great Britain limiting immigration, and yet that's exactly what, when you consider what Trump and his ICE agents are doing. I mean, everything that Thomas Jefferson and those other signatories on that document, penned, everything that they claimed Great Britain was doing, the United States has done, and worse, including the only country on the planet to decimate a population with the use of nuclear weapons. Only one country has ever dropped nuclear bombs on, and not just on military targets, on civilian targets. And they did that, and they did it after they had already decimated in one of the largest aerial assaults of all time, 6 months prior. Dropping 2 atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima weren't even necessary. They did it because they could. And they did it, frankly, as a warning shot to the rest of the world. This is how the United States proclaimed its military superiority. Not just because they had a bomb, because they were willing to use it. The only country on the earth, on the planet, that has murdered people with nuclear weapons is the United States. Let me say it again, in case you didn't hear me the first time or you didn't know. There's only one country on the planet that has used a nuclear weapon, and they did it twice, against a population that had already been decimated by one of the largest aerial assaults ever committed against a country 6 months prior. So yeah, that's the United States. That's the self-righteous United States that's going to celebrate its Declaration of Independence. If it were only a Declaration of Independence 250 years ago, if that's all the United States did was declare its independence, but that was never the plan. And consistently, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the United States was striving to do one thing: dominate the planet. And now, as things seem to be not going so well, where you throw the rest of the world is essentially in a state of chaos. That's where things are. Look, we've got several weeks before the 4th of July, and I'm going to spend the next couple of weeks speaking consistently about the atrocities the United States has committed, not just about against Native people, but I want to show, and I'll go through it. I'll itemize, go through the complaints filed in the Declaration of Independence, the facts submitted to a candid world, and let's look and see how many of those facts submitted to a candid world by the United States that the United States has done consistently, repeatedly, for 2.5 centuries. That's what people need to be aware of. And me, look, I'm not trying to topple the United States. I'm just trying to fight for our own free and independent existence. That's what me and so many of our other people, the reason we did the film that we did, the Long Hope, is because we're just suggesting that we have the right to exist as a distinct people. Forcing U.S. citizenship upon us is unlawful. It's illegal. It has been basically been designated as a war crime 10 years before they did it. And yet this is where we remain. So look, I want to thank you for listening and joining me for the program. We'll be back next week, and we're going to pound on more of this. You're going to know more about the Declaration of Independence than you care to know between now and the 4th of July. I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. Yahweh.